The sun of Corellian IV burned like fire above the endless red desert. The wind carried dust across the plains, whispering through the bones of old machines left by forgotten wars. The Corellians lived quietly there, tall, silver-skinned beings with gentle hands and slow voices. They were farmers, not fighters. They believed that the stars should bring peace, not destruction. In a small valley surrounded by dry cliffs, a Corellian elder named Roa lived with his family. His home was built from sandstone and hope. Every morning he would watch the sunrise and thank the universe for one more day of calm. But on that day something strange happened. It began as a thunder in the sky. A low, deep sound that made the ground tremble. The Corellians looked up, confused. The clouds burned orange. Then, like a wounded bird, a small ship tore through the atmosphere, leaving a trail of black smoke behind it. It screamed across the sky and crashed beyond the ridge with a burst of fire and dust. Roa's people ran for shelter, frightened. But Roa stood still, his long fingers pressed to his chest. "Something fell from the heavens," he said softly. "Something. Alive." Despite the others' fear, Roa gathered a small group and walked toward the crash site. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning metal. The ground was hot, glowing with the heat of the impact. And there, among the twisted remains of the ship, lay a creature they had never seen before. It was a human. His body was covered in a dark suit, torn in places with blood seeping through. His face was pale, his breath shallow and painful. One arm was trapped under a piece of metal, and his eyes flickered open for just a moment, full of confusion and fear. The Corellians hesitated. "Is it a soldier?" one whispered. "Humans are dangerous. They bring war." Roa looked at the dying man and shook his head. "He is not war," he said quietly. "He is a life." With great effort, they freed him from the wreckage and carried him back to their village. Many were afraid that the Terrans would come searching for their lost one, bringing death to Corellian. But Roa only said, "If we let him die, we will lose our soul before they even arrive." They laid the human in Roa's home. He burned with fever for many days. The Corellian healers worked endlessly, using their cooling stones and light medicines to calm his body. Roa's granddaughter Lyra sat beside him every night, changing his bandages and whispering soft songs. Sometimes the man spoke in his sleep, strange Terran words, fragments of pain and memory. "Don't let them die," he murmured one night. "I promised I'd come back." Lyra didn't understand his words, but she felt his sadness. She pressed a hand to his forehead and said, "You are safe here, traveler." Weeks passed. Slowly, his wounds began to close. His strength returned, though he was still weak. One morning, his eyes opened fully for the first time. They were blue, the kind of blue that reminded Lyra of the twin moons before dawn. He tried to sit up. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice rough. "You are on Corellian IV," Roa said gently. "You fell from the sky." The man blinked, confused. "My ship, the storm." He looked around, realizing these beings had cared for him. "You helped me," Roa smiled faintly. "You were lost. We could not leave you to die." Days later, the man was able to walk. He told them his name, Captain Elias Ward from the Terran Union. His ship had been caught in a meteor storm while traveling through the outer systems. He had crashed by chance with no signal strong enough to call for rescue. Elias worked with the Corellians to repair what little was left of his craft. He taught them small things about human tools, while they taught him about Corellians' gentle life, their farming, their songs, their belief that kindness returns across time. When his ship was finally ready to fly again, the whole village came to see him off. Lyra stood closest, holding a piece of Corellian crystal, glowing faintly blue. "Take this," she said, "so you remember that peace lives somewhere in the stars." Elias smiled and took it carefully. "I'll never forget," he promised. "If ever you need help and if danger comes, a call on this frequency." He handed Roa a small device, The Terran Union will hear you. Roa nodded but smiled sadly. Humans forget quickly. The stars change and so do hearts. Elias looked at them all one last time. Not all of us, he said. His ship lifted slowly into the sky, leaving a trail of silver light. The Corellians watched until it became a star among stars. Lyra whispered, "Do you think he'll remember us?" Roa looked at the horizon. "I don't know, child. But sometimes even the smallest kindness can echo through the universe." Far above them, Captain Elias Ward carried that promise, and somewhere deep inside him, he knew he would never forget the people who saved a broken stranger from the dust. Many years passed after the human, Captain Elias Ward, flew away from Corellian Amor. The red desert healed, the wind softened, and the Corellians returned to their peaceful lives. The story of the human became a tale told to children. They called him the Sky Stranger. The elders would point to the stars and say, "Once we saved one of them, and he promised to remember us." The young ones would laugh, not out of mockery but innocence. To them it sounded like a bedtime story, something beautiful but far away. Even Lyra, who had once cared for the man, grew older and began to doubt. "Perhaps humans forget," she said to herself sometimes when the night grew quiet. Life went on, slow and calm, until one evening when a shadow fell upon the sky. It started as a hum, low and trembling, shaking the air. Then lights appeared above the horizon, not stars but ships. Dark, heavy ships that spread across the clouds like a sickness. The Corellians gathered outside, staring upward in fear. The ships carried a symbol, a burning eye with 3 lines through it. Roa's face turned pale. He had seen that mark before long ago in trade records. "The Dravak Empire," he whispered. "Conquerors, slavers. They take what they want." That night fire rained from the sky. The Dravak ships descended upon Corellion 4. Their machines rolled across the deserts, their soldiers marching through the dust. Villages were destroyed, fields burned, and families taken away in chains. The Corellians had no armies, no weapons, no power to fight. Their songs of peace were drowned by the roar of the invaders. Roa, now old and frail, gathered the survivors in the caves of the Terran cliffs. The caves were deep and cool, echoing with fear and sorrow. Lyra, now a grown woman, stood beside him. "We must call for help," she said, her voice shaking. "Who will come?" A young Corellian asked bitterly. "No one even knows our name." Roa closed his eyes. In his hands he held something small, a broken, dusty object wrapped in cloth. Slowly he unwrapped it. It was the old Terran transponder, the one Captain Elias had left behind. Lyra gasped. "You still have it?" "I kept it," Roa said softly. "Not because I believed, but because I wanted to." He brushed off the dust and looked at the tiny light still faintly glowing after all these years. His old fingers trembled as he pressed the button. Nothing happened at first. Then a weak blue light blinked 3 times, as if the device was trying to remember what it once was. Lyra took a deep breath and leaned close to the transmitter. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "To Captain Elias Ward, this is Corellion 4. If you still remember us, please. We need help. The Dravaks are here. They're killing us. Please, if you can hear this." The message ended. The cave fell silent. Hours passed, then days. Nothing came. Some Corellians began to lose hope. "He forgot," one said bitterly. "The humans have their own wars. Why would they care about us?" Roa said nothing. He just stared at the small device in his hands, waiting for a light that didn't return. The Dravaks grew crueler each day. They took the younger ones, burned the water fields, and left the old to starve. Lyra watched her world crumble, her heart heavy with anger and helplessness. One night she sat at the cave's mouth and looked at the stars. The same stars where Elias had once disappeared. Tears rolled down her face. "Maybe he's gone," she whispered. Maybe humans do forget, but deep in her chest something refused to die, a small flicker of faith. Weeks passed. The Corellians prepared to abandon their home entirely, to scatter into the desert. Roa's health worsened. His breath came in short, weak gasps. On the last night before their escape, Lyra sat beside him. He smiled faintly, his voice little more than a whisper. "Do not lose hope, child. Sometimes, even light takes time to travel across the dark." The next morning, the Dravak flagship appeared above the valley. The sky turned black with its shadow. The Corellians stood together, clutching one another, waiting for death. And then, suddenly, as all across the horizon, the clouds began to glow. A strange hum filled the air, deeper and stronger than before. The Dravak soldiers paused, looking up. The Corellians stared in awe as hundreds of white streaks cut through the clouds, each one descending fast and bright. Roa opened his eyes and whispered, "The stars, they are answering." The ships emerged through the smoke, sleek, gray, marked with blue insignias that shone like fire. The Terran fleet had arrived. A voice thundered through every channel, clear and powerful. "This is Admiral Elias Ward of the Terran Union. To the Dravak Empire, stand down immediately." The Corellians could not believe what they heard. After all those years, after so much silence, he had come. Lyra pressed her hands to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "He remembered," she whispered, above them. The stars burned brighter than ever, and the promise that once seemed forgotten was finally alive again. The sky above Corellian 4 had never looked so alive. What once was soft red and gold was now filled with streaks of light, like 1,000 falling stars tearing through the heavens. The Corellians stood frozen, staring upward. For generations they had looked at the stars with peace and dreams. Now for the first time they saw power. The Dravak soldiers panicked. Their commanders shouted orders in harsh metallic tones. Giant war machines turned their cannons toward the sky, ready to fire. But it was too late. From beyond the clouds, ships emerged. Massive gray vessels with glowing blue engines, each one bearing the insignia of the Terran Union. Their armor shimmered like steel rain. Roa, weak and frail, whispered from where he lay among the others. "The humans. They came." Lyra's heart beat fast. She had dreamed of this moment but never believed it would truly happen. She looked up at the largest ship in the center, where the Terran flag burned bright. She knew, somehow, that Elias Ward was there. Across the Corellian sky, a voice boomed through every comm and speaker. The tone was calm, deep, and full of strength. "This is Admiral Elias Ward of the Terran Union Fleet. To the Dravak Empire. This world is under Terran protection. Withdraw immediately or face our fire." The Dravak commander answered with laughter. His voice echoed from the black flagship orbiting above. "Human, you stand against the Empire with a handful of ships? Do you think old promises make you strong?" Elias's voice came again, steady as stone. "No, promises don't make us strong. Keeping them does." For a moment there was silence, heavy and endless. Then the Dravak ships moved. Thousands of crimson beams shot down from orbit, turning the desert into fire. The ground shook. Corellians screamed as mountains cracked and sand turned to glass. The Terran fleet did not flinch. Every ship in formation glowed with blue light as energy shields flared to life. Terran gunships dove through the storm, their engines roaring like thunder, and then, all at once, every Terran gun fired. The night sky turned white. Railguns unleashed lines of fire that cut through Dravak cruisers like paper. Missiles streaked across the clouds, leaving trails of light. Plasma cannons rained destruction, shaking the heavens themselves. Lyra covered her ears as the roar filled the valley. The Corellians could only watch in awe. Above them, the stars seemed to dance in rage and beauty. The fury of a promise remembered. The Terrans fought like ghosts from a legend. Their movements were perfect, coordinated, almost graceful. Every time a Dravak ship turned its weapons toward the planet, a Terran vessel moved in between, protecting Corellian with its own body. Inside his flagship, Elias stood tall on the command deck. His crew shouted coordinates, alerts, and damage reports, but his eyes stayed locked on the planet below. on the people who had once saved him. Status. He barked. Shields at 60%. The Dravak flagship is powering its main cannon. Elias clenched his fist. Then we take it out before it fires. The Terran fleet formed into a V-shape charging upward. The human ships, though smaller and fewer, moved like living creatures and as full of will and defiance. The Dravaks had numbers, but the Terrans had something else. Purpose. Roa watched the battle with tears in his old eyes. So much fire, and yet it burns for us, the Corellians prayed in silence. Every flash of light in the sky was a life given for their world. Then came a moment that no one would ever forget. The Dravak flagship began to glow red, energy gathering at its core. It aimed its massive weapon toward the planet, toward the caves where the Corellians hid. Lyra gasped. They're going to destroy us. Before the weapon could fire, one Terran battleship broke formation, the Starfall, Elias Ward's command ship. It dove straight into the enemy's line of fire. The Terran crew didn't hesitate. They knew what they were doing. The Dravak cannon fired, a beam of pure death, and it hit the Starfall directly. For a moment, everything went white. The ship shook, alarms blaring, hull cracking apart. But instead of falling, the Starfall kept flying, cutting through fire like a blade through wind. Elias's voice rang out through the intercom, calm even as his ship burned. All ships, concentrate fire on my mark. For Corellian, fire! The fleet answered with thunder. Hundreds of Terran cannons unleashed one final storm. The Dravak flagship broke apart, exploding in silence, its fire swallowed by the dark. And then, suddenly, everything was still. The sky turned quiet again. The smoke drifted away. The Dravak ships began to retreat, fleeing into the stars. On the ground, the Corellians stepped out from the caves. The war was over. The sky that once burned now shimmered with calm light. Lyra fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. They did it, she whispered. They saved us. Roa looked up, his voice weak but proud. No, child. They remembered us. High above, the Starfall floated among the wreckage, scarred, battered, but alive. And somewhere inside that ship, Admiral Elias Ward stood in silence, watching the planet that had once saved him. The promise had been kept, but the cost had only begun. The battle was over, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was heavy, deep, and full of loss. The red desert of Corellian 4 was quiet once more, though smoke still rose from the horizon like ghosts climbing toward the stars. Pieces of burning metal fell from the sky, landing softly in the sand. Lyra stood outside the caves, watching the human ships above. Their lights blinked like faint stars, broken and weary from war. The Corellians around her were silent, no cheers, no songs, only awe. They had witnessed something they could not describe. The Dravak fleet was gone. The invincible empire had retreated, leaving behind only wreckage. The Terrans had fought not for themselves, but for Corellian, for a promise made long ago. And now that promise had cost them dearly. Lyra's hands trembled as she looked up. One ship, the Starfall, Admiral Elias Ward's flagship, drifted lower, its engines flickering weakly. Large cracks ran along its hull and pieces of armor had burned away. Still, it held together, refusing to fall. When it finally landed near the old valley, a cloud of dust rose around it. The Corellians gathered slowly, fearful yet drawn to the sight. The great metal beast had come down to rest where the sky once tore open, the same place where Elias had crashed all those years ago. Lyra's heart pounded. Memories returned. The stranger they had once saved, lying in the sand, half dead and helpless. Could it really be him after all these years? As the ship's ramp lowered with a hiss, human soldiers stepped out, their armor dark, scratched, covered in dust. They moved slowly, carefully, their eyes scanning the peaceful aliens who had once saved their leader. And then he came. Admiral Elias Ward walked down the ramp. His hair was gray now, his face lined with age and battle, but his eyes, those clear blue eyes, were the same. When Lyra saw him, her breath caught in her throat. It was as if time itself had bent to keep its promise. She stepped forward, trembling. "Captain Elias?" He looked at her for a long moment, his expression softening. "Lyra," he said quietly, recognizing her voice after all the years. "You grew up." Tears filled her eyes. "You came back." "You remembered?" Elias nodded slowly. "You saved me when I had nothing, not even hope." "How could I forget that?" Behind him, Terran medics and soldiers moved among the Corellians, offering food, water, and medical kits. Some Corellians touched their hands shyly, surprised by the warmth of the humans' kindness. But Elias stood still, looking around the ruined land. "I wish we had come sooner," he said softly. "So many of your people." Lyra shook her head. "You came when no one else would." "That is enough." A weak cough came from behind her. Roa was being helped forward by two young Corellians. His steps were slow, his body frail, but his eyes were bright. When Elias saw him, he immediately dropped to one knee. "Elder Roa," he said quietly. "You saved my life once." Roa smiled, his voice trembling. "And now you have saved ours." "I told them you would not forget." Elias bowed his head. "Many of my people died to keep that promise. They didn't fight for orders. They fought for something pure, for kindness." Roa placed a thin hand on the human's shoulder. "Kindness is never wasted, Admiral, even across time." Elias looked up at the Corellian sky, a sky now filled with silence instead of fire. "We will rebuild this world with you," he said. "Humanity will not leave you again." Lyra felt tears roll down her cheeks. For the first time in many seasons, she smiled. Not in joy, but in relief. The stars had not lied. As night fell, small fires burned across the valley where humans and Corellians worked side by side. They shared food, stories, and quiet laughter. The smell of smoke mixed with the sound of peace. Above them, broken ships still drifted in orbit, glowing faintly, reminders of sacrifice. Later, as Elias sat beside the old crash site, Lyra joined him. The air was cool and the desert wind whispered softly through the rocks. He held something in his hand, a small piece of blue crystal, cracked but still glowing faintly. It was the same gift she had given him so long ago. "I kept it," he said quietly, "all these years. Every time I looked at it, I remembered your words and that peace lives somewhere in the stars." Lyra smiled gently. "And you brought that peace back." Elias shook his head. "No, you gave it to me first." For a long while, they sat in silence, human and Corellian, watching the stars flicker above the quiet world. When dawn came, light spread across the sand, touching the faces of both peoples. The war had taken much, but something greater had been born: trust. The Corellians would tell their children about that day, the day when every Terran gun fired, and the stars went silent not in fear but in respect, and in that silence, they found hope. The sun rose slowly over the red sands of Corellian 4. It painted the sky in soft gold and orange, like the world itself was trying to heal after all the fire. The war was over, but the wounds it left behind were deep, both in the land and in the hearts of those who survived. Human ships rested quietly in the distance, some broken, some still standing proud despite the scars of battle. The air smelled of smoke and metal, mixed with the sweetness of Corellian's morning breeze. Lyra walked among the ruins, helping where she could. Terran medics worked beside Corellian healers, sharing tools and medicines. The sound of human voices mixed with the gentle tones of her people. Strange yet comforting. Everywhere she looked, she saw kindness. A Terran soldier giving his last water ration to a Corellian child. A medic treating an alien wound with trembling hands. Two species united by something greater than survival. But not all was peace. Not all hearts were light. At the edge of the valley, near the silent wreck of the Starfall, Admiral Elias Ward stood alone. His uniform was torn, his arm bandaged, and his eyes distant. He looked up at the sky that once burned with war and now glowed softly with peace. Behind him, the graves of his crew stretched across the sand, hundreds of small metal markers shining faintly in the sunlight. He could still hear their voices, the ones who had followed him into battle, who had fought not for glory but for a promise. Every name carved into the steel felt like a weight pressing on his soul. Lyra approached quietly, carrying a small Corellian flower, pale blue and fragile. She placed it near one of the graves and said softly, "They will rest in light." Elias didn't look at her. His voice was low, heavy with guilt. "I brought them here. I told them why we were fighting. They believed in me, and now they're gone." "They believed in what you stood for," Lyra said gently, "and that was kindness. That is not a small thing, Admiral." He finally turned to her. "Kindness doesn't bring them back." "No," she whispered, "but it gives their deaths meaning." For a long time, they stood in silence, the wind brushing past them, carrying the scent of dust and memory. Nearby, the Corellians were building shelters for the humans, sharing their remaining food and water. It was strange. The people who had been saved now helping their saviors heal. Later that evening, as the twin moons rose over the horizon, Roa called everyone to the center of the village. The old Corellian's health was fading, but his spirit was still strong. Humans and Corellians gathered together, forming a circle around a large fire that glowed blue against the night. "This world was touched by fire," Roa said, his voice soft but steady. "It burned us and it burned them. Yet from that fire something new was born, friendship." He looked at the Terrans. "You came when no one else did. You fought for a promise made long ago by one man and one village. Today Corellian stands because you remembered us." Elias lowered his head humbly. "We owed you that much." Roa smiled faintly. "No, Admiral. You owed us nothing. But you came anyway. That is what makes humans special. You remember hearts, not debts." Lyra felt tears in her eyes. Around her, Corellian children touched the shiny metal of Terran armor, fascinated and unafraid. The humans smiled back, laughing softly. It was a strange sight. Soldiers with weary faces finding peace in the laughter of alien children. Later that night, Elias sat near the fire alone. The sky above was endless and filled with quiet stars. Lyra joined him again, sitting close but not speaking for a while. Finally, Elias broke the silence. "I used to think duty was everything. Orders, missions, victories. But out there in that wreckage I realized something." "What?" she asked softly. "That a promise, even a small one, can change the fate of worlds." Lyra smiled, her silver eyes reflecting the firelight. "You kept your promise. That's what matters." Elias looked at her with tired eyes, but for the first time in many days he smiled. "No, Lyra, we kept it." The wind carried their words into the night, gentle and endless. By morning, the Terrans had begun repairs on their ships. Corellians brought food and water, working side by side. The war had left scars, but those scars would become stories. Stories that their children would tell under the stars. And as Elias looked once more at the horizon, where his journey had begun years ago as a lost, broken man, he realized something simple but true. The Corellians had saved his life once. Now, humanity had saved their world. And somewhere in between those two acts of kindness, something eternal had been born. A bond that no war could ever break. As the sun rose higher, Elias placed his hand on the symbol of his fleet, whispering to the graves behind him, "Rest easy, my friends. The promise is kept," the wind answered softly, carrying his words across the desert, across the silence that followed every Terran gun. The dawn came quietly over the horizon, painting the silver dunes of Corellian in gentle gold. The air was cool, carrying the soft hum of repair drones and the distant voices of humans preparing their ships for departure. The war had ended days ago, but the planet still breathed in slow recovery. Smoke no longer rose from the fields. The fires were gone. In their place, laughter sometimes returned, shy, uncertain, but real. Admiral Elias Ward stood near the Terran command post, watching the light creep across the valley. The Starfall II, his new flagship, waited in orbit, ready to take the surviving Terran soldiers home. But for him, leaving didn't feel like victory. It felt like the closing of a chapter he never wanted to end. Behind him, Corellians worked beside humans, repairing homes, cleaning debris, rebuilding life piece by piece. He saw Lyra among them, her white cloak flowing with the wind, her silver eyes reflecting the morning light. She was speaking with a group of Terran engineers, showing them how to reinforce Corellian stone with human alloys. Elias smiled faintly. She belonged here, among her people, among peace, but his heart was heavy. He had seen too much war, too many promises turned to ashes. Yet this world, this single forgotten planet, had reminded him why humanity still mattered. Lyra noticed him standing there and walked over, her steps soft on the sand. "You're leaving soon," she said gently. Elias nodded. "The fleet is ready. We depart by noon." Lyra's expression softened. "And you?" He looked at the horizon. "I'm ready to go, but I don't think I'll ever truly leave." For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of the wind filled the silence, whispering between them like an old friend. "You know," Lyra said softly, "when I first saw you years ago, you were lost, broken. You had nothing but hope and a promise. My father believed in you." Elias smiled sadly. "Roa believed in everyone, even in a man who didn't believe in himself." She touched his arm gently. "He was right about you. You kept your promise. You brought hope back to us." Elias looked down at her hand. "And you brought it back to me." Her eyes shimmered. "Then perhaps we both kept the promise." They stood there quietly as the wind carried the voices of both species working together. Terrans and Corellians sharing food, stories, and laughter. Once enemies of circumstance, now family by heart. Later, the Corellian Council held a farewell ceremony. It was simple, under the same ancient tree where the first promise had been made, the same place where Roa had once welcomed a wounded human long ago. The old tree's silver leaves shone softly in the sunlight. The Corellian sang a song of peace, low, melodic, and full of emotion. The humans stood respectfully, many not understanding the words but feeling the meaning deep in their souls. When the song ended, Lyra stepped forward. She held in her hands a small stone pendant, carved with the Corellian symbol for memory. She offered it to Elias. "This is for you," she said. "So you will not forget our light." Elias took it carefully. The stone was smooth, warm, alive with quiet energy. "I could never forget," he said softly. "This place, your people, you." The crowd was silent. For a moment, the weight of the galaxy seemed to fade, replaced by something timeless and pure. As the ceremony ended, the Terran troops began their final preparations. Engines roared softly in the distance, echoing across the dunes. Elias stood by the loading ramp, his heart heavy with a strange ache, the ache of leaving something he loved behind. Lyra approached him one last time. "When you first came here, I thought humans were loud and reckless," she said with a small smile. "Now I know. You are just loud with your hearts." Elias chuckled quietly. "And you, Lyra, are too quiet with yours." She looked at him, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "Will we see you again?" He wanted to promise yes, but he couldn't lie to her. "If the stars are kind," he said softly. "And if they are not, remember that somewhere out there, a human remembers Corellian." She stepped closer, reaching up and pressing her forehead gently against his, the Corellian gesture of deep trust. For a moment, Elias closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of her touch, the heartbeat of a world he had once nearly destroyed but now helped to save. When she stepped back, her eyes glistened. "Go, Elias Ward. Carry our story with you." He nodded, his voice low. "Always." The ramp closed slowly behind him, the sound echoing across the valley. As the Starfall II lifted into the sky, Corellians watched in silence and not with fear but with pride. The great Terran fleet rose like silver birds into the blue morning, leaving behind trails of light. Lyra stood under the ancient tree, her hand on the pendant around her neck, the twin to the one Elias carried. She watched until the last ship vanished into the clouds, and when the sky returned to peace, she whispered softly, "They once came to us in pain. They left us in hope." The wind carried her words across the sand, to the graves, to the mountains, to the stars themselves, and far beyond Corellian's orbit, in the silent heart of the Terran fleet, Admiral Elias Ward opened his hand, the stone pendant still warm, and smiled through the ache in his chest. He whispered back, "We never truly leave those who save us." The stars blinked in reply, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of peace. Years passed. The war became memory. The scars on Corellian healed beneath green fields and blue rivers once more. Children played where soldiers once fought, and stories of the Terrans became legends whispered beneath the stars. But far beyond that quiet world, the galaxy was changing again. Empires rose and fell, armies gathered in the dark, and in the endless night between the stars, someone forgot what the Terrans once did. It began with a border war, small, meaningless at first. Then it spread. The Jareth Dominion, proud and cruel, began conquering worlds that could not defend themselves. They called humans primitive dreamers, too sentimental to survive. But the Dominion made one mistake. They reached Corellian. When their fleets appeared in orbit, the Corellians did not raise their weapons. They simply sent a message, short and calm, to the approaching invaders. "We are under Terran protection." The Jareth laughed. "Terran protection? Humans have no fleets here. They have forgotten you." But Corellian knew better. Lyra, now older and wiser, stood at the edge of the same valley where she had once watched the Terrans leave. The pendant Elias Ward had given her still hung around her neck. It glowed softly, a reminder of a promise that never died. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "If you can hear us, Elias Ward, we call upon the promise." For days nothing happened. The Jareth descended, building bases and preparing to burn Corellian cities. Lyra led her people to shelter, her heart heavy but not hopeless. Then, on the seventh night, the stars moved. From the darkness, ships began to appear, massive, silver, and burning with blue fire. The Terran fleet had returned. Thousands of ships, thousands of lives answering a promise made generations ago. The Corellians ran to the hills, cheering through tears. Lyra fell to her knees, unable to speak as the sky lit up with Terran engines. The Jareth fleet sent a warning. "This world belongs to the Dominion now." The Terran commander, a young woman named Captain Mira Ward, granddaughter of Elias Ward, replied softly, "This world once saved one of ours. Today humanity remembers." And then, for the first time in centuries, every Terran gun fired. The battle was short. The Jareth had numbers. The Terrans had purpose. They fought with precision and fury. Not for conquest, not for glory, but for a promise kept in blood and time. Each blast of light across the black sky carried the echo of Elias Ward's voice, the memory of Lyra's kindness, the bond that once joined two species under fire. And then, as the last enemy ship fell burning into the void, the Terran guns went silent. Not one voice cheered. Not one soldier shouted in victory. The silence that followed was deep and heavy, a silence of respect. Every Terran ship lowered its banners. Every Corellian stood in awe. Captain Mira opened a channel to the planet. Her face appeared on the screens, calm, composed, yet her eyes were full of emotion. "We do not fight for revenge," she said softly. "We fight for memory. When Corellian helped a lost human long ago, they gave us something greater than strength. They gave us heart. And today that heart speaks for all of us. Lyra listened with tears streaming down her face. The pendant at her chest glowed brighter, reacting to something deep and unseen. A bond that stretched across bloodlines, across galaxies. The Corellian people stepped out of their shelters, hands raised toward the sky. Children watched as the Terran fleet hovered above them like silent guardians. Then slowly, one by one, the Terran ships turned off their weapons. Their engines dimmed. The silence deepened. It wasn't the silence of war ending. It was the silence of understanding, of two worlds breathing together. Mira looked at the stars and whispered the same words her grandfather once said long ago. We never truly leave those who save us. From orbit, the Terran fleet began to depart, leaving behind peace, not occupation. They placed a single monument in orbit, a silver ring, engraved with Corellian script and Terran words side by side. It read, "In the silence after every gun we remember." Years later, Corellian became the heart of a new alliance, the Terran-Corellian Accord, built on compassion, not power. Children on both worlds were taught the same story, about a wounded man found by an alien village, about a promise that shaped the future, about how kindness echoed louder than any weapon ever could. And somewhere, in the quiet halls of a Terran museum, beneath the preserved hull of the Starfall, lay two stone pendants, one Corellian, one Terran, still faintly glowing. Visitors often stopped there, reading the inscription below. They once helped a human. Years later, when every Terran gun fired, silence followed, because some promises are written not in history, but in the heart of humanity itself, and that silence, deep, eternal, and peaceful, became the sound of something far greater than war. It became the sound of gratitude.